The Bewitched is subtitled A Dance Satire. It begins with a prologue in which one lost musician wanders onto a dark stage filled with strange, seemingly unreal instruments. He goes to one, a huge percussion instrument, and begins to play. Other lost musicians wander in, go to instruments, begin to play, and follow the beat. It becomes apparent very soon that they are no longer lost in the first sense, but in quite another sense are lost in themselves, their beat, their power, and finally their vision. Out of this vision an ancient witch appears, first as a spirit, then as a body and a voice. She is not a malevolent figure out of Christian folklore, but an ancient being with the power of perception, and also the power to invoke perception. Incidentally, one of the ancient roots of the word witch comes from the verb to see. The musicians of this work, far from languishing in a pit, become an on-stage articulate chorus, singing, whistling, shouting, stamping their feet, and contributing in a corporeal way to the dramatic tension of every scene. The ancient witch surveys the modern world and immediately becomes sad and moody. She finds many situations ripe for her intuitive powers, almost too many. She calls the scenes forth, one by one. The actors, the dancers in this case, appear, and at the climax of each scene, the witch strikes with a shaft of musical illumination through her chorus of displaced musicians. The Bewitched, on its face at least, is not a tragedy, but the analogy with ancient lyric tragedy is apparent. The witch is the oracle. The musicians constitute the chorus, always under the oracle's power of suggestion, and the dancers are the actors, working out their modern bewitchments and their destinies in every scene. The latitude in which to approach the abstraction known as art is wide indeed. At one extreme is the general, the non-specific, the established and fairly rigid form, along with such edifying concepts as faith, hope, charity, liberty, equality, fraternity. Looming behind is the bewildering knowledge of the modern world, and its even more bewildering surmises, its technical materials and specialized skills. In the opposite latitude is the very small and minute thing, the intimate, the trivial, the fleeting instant, and the more primitive materials. I personally prefer to approach art in this way, in the manner of a Chinese poem, to attempt to imbue the remote place, the trivial incident, the block of wood or the stretched string, with a significance and a transcendence far beyond the mere verbal statements about them. Thus, I come to the 10 scenes of The Bewitched, 3 of which are to be heard on this program. First, however, allow me to compound the fantasy of this seemingly real world, to say that 10 unusual instruments are heard in this performance. I built them myself, not as a theorist, but as a composer who felt a crying need for exactly these materials. The instruments weigh about 2,500 pounds, take up about 500 square feet of floor space, and require an entire furniture van for their transportation. 6 of them are percussion instruments, mostly of the marimba type, from small to huge. 3 are plucked string instruments, from small to 7 feet in height, and 1 is a microtonal reed organ. As for the more traditional instruments, 1 oriental and 4 western instruments are heard: koto, cello, piccolo, clarinet, bass clarinet. The Bewitched was commissioned by the University of Illinois and the Fromm Foundation for the Festival of Contemporary Arts in 1957.
Danlee Mitchell, January 3rd, 1980.
I came from musical parents. My mother was a pianist, my father was a professional singer, and they got me involved in piano at a very early age, and then I went into percussion in grade school also, and I continued piano and percussion clear up and through college. Then in college I switched over to percussion exclusively. I'd also in high school and junior high played in lots of bands and orchestras and honor bands and things like that in the state of Washington. I'm from Tacoma, Washington, and I went to the University of Illinois in 1956 because I had heard it was a good musical institution, and also that I heard that there was a percussion teacher there that I wanted to study from. So that's why I went to the University of Illinois. And
Involved with Harry in 56 and 57 in Illinois.
yeah, I met him specifically in the basement of the music building with some boards and some metal rods in his hands, walking down to a rehearsal we were having of a percussion ensemble, and he was introduced to me as Harry Partch, the composer. I didn't know much about him at all. I was very unknowledgeable about contemporary music, really, at that time. I was only 18, 19 years old. But I was very much interested in percussion and music. And I had seen some advance publicity about him in the fall of 1956 in the university papers about this composer who was coming, and he had many unusual instruments that he had hand-built by himself. But this didn't really have too much of an impression on me, other than I thought that was very interesting. But I was very young. And then I met him that day with all these materials in his hands, and he had a very warm feeling about him, a very warm vibration, and I was introduced to him, and I was asked if I'd be interested in playing his ensemble, and I hadn't seen the instruments, and so I said, yes, I will come over to your studio at the first possible time I can and look at what instruments were there. So I went over to the studio in a few days, and he showed me the instruments, as I recall, and they were looking for, at that time, a diamond marimbist. They had a bass marimbist, and they had a bowist, and they had an eroica player, but the diamond marimba was kind of a hard instrument, and I don't know why no one had chosen the diamond marimba, but it took a good mallet player, which I was a very good mallet player, and so I started playing the diamond marimba, and then I was practiced more and more on the part, which we were doing the Bewitched at the time. At this 1957 Festival of Contemporary Music, they had brought Harry on the campus of the University of Illinois to perform for the first time the world premiere of the Bewitched. So I got involved, and in the spring of '57 we did perform the Bewitched at the world premiere at the University of Illinois.
Well, then, after 57, were you subsequently involved with Harry on a continuous basis, or has it been off and on?
After 1950, after the performances were over of the Bewitched in '57, Harry's support was up. He was only there for 1 year, and so I and other people in the ensemble helped pack him up in this big U-Haul truck, and he went off to Yellow Springs, Ohio, to the university in Yellow Springs. I forget the name of the university. It's not on the top of my head right now. Antioch College, that's what it is, in Yellow Springs. And he had some friends there who offered him space. They didn't offer him any faculty position or anything, but they offered him space. And so he went over there, and we packed up the truck. And then that next year, the fall of '57, the spring of '58, the fall of '57, I mean, I went back to my normal studies, I guess, at the University of Illinois, normal percussion playing, and we sort of kept track of what Harry was doing through my teacher, Jack McKenzie, and the conductor of the Bewitched at the time, John Garvey. They were both very interested in Harry and his music, and very supportive. And so by the grapevine, it was learned that he had left Yellow Springs and had went to Chicago to write music for a woman filmmaker in Chicago. Her name was Madeline Turtellow. And he not only wrote the score for one of her short films, which was called Wind Song, but she became so interested in his music that they shot a movie of him doing the music of Windsong as sort of a film documentary, although it was much more interesting than a documentary film. It was truly a good film of Harry living in Chicago at the time. So I was, of course, in downstate Illinois, so I thought I'd go up and visit him. And in 1958, the spring of 1958, I was student teaching in a suburb of Chicago. So I went and visited him in Evanston. That's where he was living. And at this time, the spring of '58, he had finished his film. They had finished with the film, and they had also finished with the documentary of him, which was called Music Studio. And I visited him at this little dumpy apartment. He at this time in his life, and probably at this time and all preceding his life in these years, he usually was sort of a hand-to-mouth type of individual. That's how he operated his life. That's how just money came to him. He was really had very meager resources all the time, and he often depended upon people like this filmmaker, Madeline Turtellow, to support him for maybe 6 months or a year or 1 month, whatever. I don't really know what the support was of her at the time. Financially, I don't have this documented. It might be documented in Harry's records and his checkbooks and things like that. But we were all very friendly, Madeline and Harry and I, and we used to do things together. She was still involved with him, but I don't think she was supporting him. But anyway, in the spring of '58, a student at Northwestern University named Elizabeth Gentry convinced the music department there that they should give Harry some space to have a studio in the old music building at the Northwestern University. This space was on the 4th floor, and you had to walk up on the 4th floor on this beautiful old wooden staircase, wide staircase, but you still had to walk up. And I don't know how he got. Oh no, I do know how he got the instruments up there. They simply sort of commandeered a whole bunch of music students from Northwestern University who were just sort of innocently standing around all the time, I guess. And they said they put a piece of instrument in their hands and they took them upstairs. So anyway, this is how the instruments got in this 4th floor, and this is where I came across Harry again in our reunion of a year up on this 4th floor place. And so we renewed our acquaintances, and we hung out, so to speak. And he, at this time, was trying to get an ensemble together just to play, just to rehearse and record his new version of U.S. Highball. And it wasn't going too well because the Northwestern students really weren't too much interested in what was going on, and they were having trouble getting people. There were a few jazz musicians who weren't percussionists who were interested, who were friends of Elizabeth Gentry's, but that's about all. So I came on the scene, and I saw that there was a sinking ship here, and so I said, well, why don't we bring up from the University of Illinois downstate the old players, and let's rehearse for 2 weeks on U.S. Highball and record it. And so this did happen, and we slept at Madeline's house, as I recall, all over the floors. This was on a very beautiful house on the shores of Lake Michigan in Evanston. And so we recorded U.S. Highball, and everybody dispersed, and this was now getting into June of '58, and Harry wanted to come out with a recording, because that's how he supported himself, was through his recordings at the time. And so he wanted to get another recording out so he could have some more income, meager as it was, but maybe $12 a day, $6 a day for a record order, $20 a week was very important to him for his room rent and his food. So we put together this recording, and the jacket, and he sent out his mailers. He had lists of people who he sent out, mailing lists, and orders came back in, and this was getting towards now, I think, about the end of June, and I was going to go back home to Tacoma, Washington to spend a couple of months, so he was getting kind of in a depressed state because he didn't see any place that he was going. There was no place that was going to support him. So he and I decided that it would be good for him to go to New York and try to get another production of The Bewitched in New York, possibly co-sponsored by the University of Illinois again. So he went to New York and he had lots of friends in New York. BMI Music, for instance, was always interested in him. Carl Haverland, who was formerly the head of, I think, what we call the classic music section of BMI, was a big supporter of Harry's, and so was Oliver Daniel, who was, I think his position was vice president. But anyway, through his friends in New York, he always did have good acquaintances in New York. Otto Luning was a big support of Harry's, and also Douglas Moore. I think through Doug Moore, a performance in New York was sponsored, was promoted, and the sponsor was going to be Columbia University, and they decided to have the performance on the stage of the old Juilliard Music School. So Harry came back to the University of Illinois, and they bought this idea of a University of Illinois group performing another performance of The Bewitched. So in '59, The Bewitched was mounted again for a second time, and this time we took it to New York and performed it 2 or 3 times there. And then the University of Illinois sort of became more interested in Harry, and they became more supportive of him. And he had in the back of his head another work that he wanted to write and to be performed, and that was Revelation in the Courthouse Park. So the University of Illinois supported him for another year, and we came back in 1959 and 1960. Let's see, 58, 59, 59, 60, and that academic year anyway, and we rehearsed and performed his extravaganza, his very large operatic setting of the work he calls Revelation in the Courthouse Park. Then the University of Illinois continued to support him, actually through the Student Union, I think it was, and they commissioned another work the next year. This would bring us up to 61, 62, yeah. And they commissioned another work which was called Water, Water, and that was done in 61, 62. And at that point, my knowledge is this, and that is they wanted to keep Harry there in the music department, but he didn't want to teach. He simply wanted to do research on his own area and compose, and they wanted him not only to do that but to teach, and he just wouldn't buy it at that time in his life, and so he left the University of Illinois and came back out to California, and this would be in the spring of '62, and he moved to Petaluma.
Mm-hmm. And then when did you renew contact with Harry?
I went to New York for 1 year. I taught at a college in New York for 1 year, and then the year after that would be '63, '64. I played in the Oklahoma City Symphony for 1 year, and Harry and I always kept in contact through letters, and I would always visit him in the summer. I visited him in the summer of '62 or 63. In the summer of '63, I visited him in San Francisco, Petaluma, and at that time he had just written the study work for Delusion of the Fury. He called it and on the seventh day petals fell in Petaluma, and he wanted to record that. So I went to Petaluma that summer and stayed there about 2 months, and he and I and Mike Ranta recorded and on the seventh day petals fell in Petaluma. That piece is a series of duets, 1-minute duets, and it was a study piece just for thematic material and how it would sound to be used, to be incorporated in his larger mime work, which was called Delusion of the Fury. And then after that was done, the place that he was living in was demolished to make a series of apartment complexes. So he put the instruments in storage and came down to San Diego at the urging of an individual in San Diego who wanted to have him down here and possibly to try to get him on the faculty at the new University of California at San Diego. So he moved down here. They weren't quite ready though for him, and so nothing ever materialized in it. Their music department didn't materialize in '62 when he came down here, or '63 I mean, and so he lived down here, and I was at that time then playing in the Oklahoma City Symphony, and a job opened up at the San Diego State University for a percussion professor, so I applied for the job and was accepted. So I moved to San Diego, and Harry was in San Diego at the same time. About this time, the spring of '64, Emil Richards became acquainted with Harry, and Emil Richards is a very famous percussionist in the Hollywood music scene. Very famous, very successful, very excellent percussionist. And he became interested in Harry, and he enticed Harry to move up to L.A. And Harry moved up to Venice. Harry moved up to Van Nuys in the summer or the fall of '64, and lived up there at Emil's urging. Emil thought maybe that Harry could be supported by himself, and Emil thought he could get a group of musicians to play his music, which he did. They did do a few concerts around L.A., which I performed in. And Harry also moved from Van Nuys to Venice. At this particular time, he also met another very important person in his life, which was Betty Freeman. And she supported him in terms of paying his rent for a nice studio in Venice, California in 1964 and 1965, the spring of '65. And in this studio, he built the Quadrangularis Reversum and many new instruments. It was a very productive time. He had the studio was an old laundromat, and it had a lot of space. So I used to go up there on weekends and help him out, hang out, and play. And at this time, he was writing Delusion of the Fury. He wrote Delusion of the Fury in this laundromat in Venice, California. We also re-recorded and sweetened up the recording of And on the Seventh Day, which was released by CRI. Some of our Petaluma recording wasn't too good, so we had to improve on it. It's really hard playing, and we just wanted to make it as good as possible. And then after, while he was living in Venice, the University of California at San Diego enticed him to come down there, offering him space in the music department. So he moved his instruments back down to San Diego, this time with space on the University of California campus. And we had our ensemble there, and we rehearsed a couple of programs. And then Betty Freeman supported, or I should say, Betty Freeman arranged to have UCLA produce Delusion of the Fury. So I took off a 6-month leave of absence from my university and managed and conducted Delusion of the Fury, which was done at UCLA. And actually, before we did this, we were given a grant by the Rockefeller Foundation to play a concert in New York. So in June of '68, I moved to Los Angeles with Harry, and we put the instruments on the UCLA campus in a building, and we rehearsed there the New York concert, and then we went to New York, and then we came back and went to a studio in Culver City, and in Culver City we rehearsed Delusion of the Fury, and we trucked the instruments to the McGowan Hall on UCLA campus, did Delusion of the Fury there, recorded it, and then after that Harry moved back down to San Diego, and sort of became a little more less active in what he was doing, although he still built instruments. And he wrote one more work after Delusion, and that was his last work, which was called The Dreamer That Remains, which was made into a film, which was produced by Betty Freeman also.
Mm-hmm. So you've been associated with Harry ever since '56?
Yeah, ever since '56 I knew Harry, yeah.
What was there about Harry that, I asked this of David also, and he was also very articulate. What was it about Harry that attracted people to him with this incredible loyalty?
Well, I don't know if I can articulate well this fact. Harry Partch had a high school education, but he was a master of the English language. He knew the language inside and out. He oftentimes used this knowledge to gain employment in proofreading. Whenever he'd go to a city or something, he could always find a job proofreading in the paper, which he did. And he also had a mind that if he looked at a piece of paper or read a page in a book, he would remember that material. He would not only understand it in depth, but he would remember it. And so he was that type of an individual. He didn't need a college education to further his mental motivations. And he was living at a time where a college education was not that important. This was during a time when most of your important composers were not necessarily college educated. They might have been involved in colleges, but on the faculties, but they were not degreed individuals. And coupled with this very articulate sense and a good sense of history was a very warm personality. And you loved to be around him. He was entertaining, he was informative, he was warm, he welcomed you. But at the same time, in relation to his music, when you were performing his music, he was very exact in what he wanted. And he let you know in a very friendly, but a very competent and clear manner what he wanted. So you're dealing with a person here who had a personality and a mind and a vibration, a Freudian balance of ego, id, and superego, which was really very, very very cozy, I would guess, so to speak. And so he attracted a lot of people to him. Not that he didn't have people who didn't like him, because he would at times get into some violent situations, usually with other creative people. But in terms of simply players like me, I was not a composer, I was not an intellectual. In terms of players, we really enjoyed being around the guy. It was a very rewarding experience just to experience this gentleman.
Mm-hmm. So then, you also were involved in the production of the Bewitched in '74, '75, and then the production of the Bewitched this year.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
The question that comes to my mind is, why the Bewitched? Why was the Bewitched done this year? Was that a specific request from the Berlin Festival that the Bewitched be done, or was it that this is the work that is in repertoire at the moment, or what?
Let me give some background on Harry's music. Harry's Harry's style of performance is a style of performance that utilizes not only his instruments and the instruments playing and the theoretical principles that were the reason for the construction of the instruments, going into a new tuning system, but he also asks that there be a visual experience for the audience also, not only an auditory but a visual in terms of lighting, we'll say, a visual in terms of costuming, a visual in terms of the musicians moving. And his mature style is this. His early style was songs and Americana type of settings that weren't necessarily visually oriented. They could be concert, but in his mature style, he went into total theater. And he went into total theater early when he was in on the ground floor of the total theater concept. Not that he realized his motivations, not that he realized his objectives, but he was in the ground floor of this movement. And his first big dramatic work, Oedipus, obviously is an opera, utilizing his particular techniques of in-tone speech and his instruments and the musicians on stage, and an integrated aspect of having dancers and musicians costumed, whatnot, lighting. That was his first attempt. It was just a straightforward attempt at an Oedipus. And after that, he did The Bewitched. Now, The Bewitched was basically a ballet. It doesn't have any text to it. It's just music and dance. And then after The Bewitched, these are his major works now. He did Revelation in the Courthouse Park, which is a coupling of a straightforward operatic setting, a coupling with not only the straightforward operatic setting, but a coupling of a more abstract, corporeal, physical relief of material. You would have a scene where you were in ancient Greece, and you had a straightforward story with dialogue and sort of songs, and then you would go into a more abstract interpretation of this in a modern setting, and he married this sort of abstract corporeal approach with his concrete corporeal approach very effectively in Revelation in the Courthouse Park. The only problem with Revelation is it takes a monstrous cast. It takes three main characters and a corps of dancers, and probably in musicians. It probably takes, I forget the exact amount of musicians, but it probably takes 20 musicians, plus a marching band, plus a contingent of gymnasts, and it's not an easy work to put on. Mm-hmm. So it's really a fantastic work to see. It's very difficult and hard to put it on, but it's really a marvel to see. So he has Revelation in the Courthouse Park, and then he had his last work, Water, Water, which was his attempt at writing a musical. Now, why then did we choose The Bewitched? Well, I chose The Bewitched in '75 because I wanted to attempt a version that he was actually aiming for. The two first performances of The Bewitched in '57 and '59 did not measure up at all to his motivations for what he wanted in terms of integration of the musicians with the dancers and his corporeal, physical approach to the audience. So he was still living at the time, and when I decided to do it in the fall of '73, in the spring of '74, we started rehearsing. I attempted to begin trying to get a more integrated approach to his music with dance and the musicians and the dancers. And this was a fairly successful beginning, I think, this third production of The Bewitched. It sort of broke the ice for potential of what what could be. It gave, I think, many people an understanding of what it is, and it gave me a great understanding of what the Bewitched is. Then, after the Bewitched, we performed U.S. Highball, and we performed other smaller pieces in various concerts. And then in the fall of '78 and the spring of '79, the Berlin Festival contacted me about their being interested in supporting a production of Partch's music. And so we had sort of a cursory dialogue of letters as, yes, I was interested in when would be a good time. And so it finally got down to, well, what shall we do? So they led off with, let's do Delusion of the Fury in Berlin. Now, Delusion of the Fury uses all of Harry's instruments, and it uses a big contingent of instrumentalists and a corps of dancers. It's a marvelously integrated work, but at the same time, it uses all of his instruments, and I just felt that it was just too much to crate up and cart off all these instruments to Berlin, and too expensive. But I did draw up a budget to do it, and they saw that it was just too big of an attempt to do. So they said, well, what else is available? And so they looked over Revelation in the Courthouse Park, and that not only was too expensive, but Berlin didn't like Revelation in the Courthouse Park.
It's certainly the most overt of Harry's works.
Yeah, their material that they inspected was a film that we made of Revelation in 1959, and it's really a terrible film. It's just a ghastly film. Mm-hmm. And so that's what they saw, and I told them not to judge the work by the film. Mm-hmm. But they felt that it just was too chancy for us to try to do that in Berlin, because they felt that they may be disappointed. Mm-hmm. So they said no to Revelation, which I did want to do very much. I would have loved to have done Revelation. And so I said, well, let's do the Bewitched. And they said, okay, that's fine. They listened to the music and looked at what Harry's concept was, and so that was what Berlin decided that we would do. And I was glad that we did it, because it gave me a chance again to do the Bewitched another way, with another interpretation, another look at it. And I've learned a lot from being involved in this fourth production of the Bewitched. And the Bewitched is really a marvelous piece, because Harry gives you the music, and then he gives you 10 scenes of magical situations in which to deal with, dance situations, but he doesn't specifically tell you how. All he says is he wants the musicians to get out on the stage once in a while and dance and move around, and he wants this corporeal concept, but he really doesn't give you the minute details. So it's really a marvelous piece for anybody to want to do, and anybody could do the Bewitched and do it in their own style. Again, as long as I feel, just as long as you are involving the musicians and the dancers. Maybe, obviously, the musicians are playing all the music, but a lot of times the musicians aren't, so you can get them out on the stage moving. And so the musicians sort of have a little bit of a hedge on the dancers there. The dancers don't usually go over and play on the instruments, which would be nice, and which they could do. And maybe someday we will have a production where you'll have an instrumentalist playing, and then all of a sudden he'll become a dancer. We're doing that in one scene in the Bewitched. One of our players does have the capacity for getting out and holding stage as a mover in scene 4. So he's doing a solo dance in scene 4. He plays the stringed instruments in all the other scenes, but in scene 4 he does not play. And it was just by chance that this worked out that way, and he was chosen to play that instrument, which doesn't play in scene 4. So he is doing the solo dance in scene 4, which I think is marvelous.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts on this current production?
direct my thoughts a little more specifically.
Okay. Well, for example, I thought the witch in this production is probably the best witch that ever has been in the Bewitched, in a number of senses. Not only the way she moves, she holds the stage for the whole piece. You know, she's a thread through it, but also in effect that, unlike previous witches that I've seen, she's sexy, and the idea of, say, a sexy witch is not what we normally associate with a witch, but certainly something Partch would think very much of witchcraft, you know, being with witchcraft being of a sexual power.
Yeah, Partch's witch. Partch didn't conceive of the witch to be a Halloween witch,
Mm-hmm.
and you'd have to read his long scenarios. He has 3 basic scenarios for the Bewitched. They were written at different times. One scenario was written before it was produced the first time, and one scenario was written after it was produced the first time, and one scenario was written after it was produced the second time, all venting his frustrations over choreographers and trying to give a little bit of armor to the Bewitched so that future mutilations wouldn't happen. But his witch is a type of witch that it comes out of the earth as, I would say, an earth mother or something like that. That isn't quite the terminology I'm looking for, but it is not a pointed hat witch of the Halloween style. And actually, Harry had in mind for his first witch Odetta, and he wrote the work around her voice. And he knew her in Sausalito when he was living there in the early 50s. He knew her, I can't say well, but he did know her, and she knew him, but it never worked out. University of Illinois gave him the support, and he left Sausalito and California without ever producing The Bewitched here. The Bewitched really was written for the musicians who were around him in the Oedipus productions and in Castor and Pollux and the Even Wild Horses music of the time. And unfortunately, he had to abandon them before he could give them his gift to them, which was The Bewitched, and for the lost musicians and the witch and whatnot.
What happens then? The question would be, what happens now after Berlin with the Partch ensemble, instruments, etc.? Do you have any future plans?
No, I don't really have any future plans for productions. Productions cost money, and I personally myself don't want to be involved. Let me restate that.
Okay.
If I'm in a university environment, and it's understood that it's in a university environment with students, I'm more than happy to play his music on that level.
Mm-hmm.
However, I don't, especially at my age, want to extend my energies on performances that fall below what I have done in the past with Harry and what I consider to be the potential for Harry's music. So I really want to be involved in performances that are of a professional caliber. So I have either the choice of staying in the academic community, which I will do, and having the instruments there and allowing students to play on the instruments, forming student ensembles and student recitals, student concerts with student musicians or student dancers, and we'll all call it, yes, a student production with the problems that are involved in student academic productions. But it's always my desire to do Harry's music on a highly professional level, because that's really where it starts to ring. It's really where it starts to gel, when you have some very talented people bringing it to life. So Revelation in the Courthouse Park has never really been done well. It's not recorded well. The recording it is out is just an atrocious recording, and it would really be nice to do a production of Revelation with as a professional company with proper funding and whatnot. It would also be nice to tour the United States, I feel, with a production of Harry's music. Going over to Europe may seem important, but I would much rather perform Harry's music in the United States on tour than going clear over there, because it's really during these times it's a little bit surreal to load up 5 large crates of instruments on this big jet plane using all this fuel and going over to Europe in the cold in the middle of winter to perform a work like this. It seems to me to make much more sense to go around your own country and let your own fellow countryman see the potential of this composer. But there are economic problems there too that are hard to surmount. We're starting to live in an era where Harry's type of environment can't support itself, because you need a large studio, I'll say of 2,000 square feet. Now, 2,000 square feet in San Diego costs about $2,000 or more, and I don't have $2,000 a month for a studio, so I have to use whatever I can scrounge at the academic community. And if you're going to go on tour, you have to pay trucking costs, motel costs, and I figure that for maybe a 1-month tour, I'd have to bring in about $15,000 a week to tour Harry's music in the United States. And that means about 2 concerts a week to do. And I don't think that there's that many places who could come up, say, with $7,000, $8,000 to do a concert, unless it was a rock and roll group or something like that. So Harry's musical milieu, his environment, although it was right for the 1930s and the 1940s and the 50s, and many people really are interested in what he's doing. If you take a good, cold, honest look at it, it can't economically survive too much in these times of austerity and high prices and inflation.
So unless somebody comes up with the money, we may not be hearing much of Partch's music for a while.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that we will simply retrench back to San Diego again and put the instruments on the campus of San Diego State University and let the academic community use the instruments as successfully as we can, and let as many people be involved. But it'll be hard to go north or east because of the tremendous costs nowadays that things are.
Thank you, Danlee. Good.
Long mountain